The final section of this slide deck is entitled the business plan. And in this, we will talk about the sections and the content of a business plan required for building a startup company. But to put that in context first, we'll talk about the steps that an entrepreneur and the entrepreneurial team must go through in order to start a company. And then you will know then how the business plan plays a very important role in that overall process. Once we have that understanding, we'll go through the 15 questions. On the next slide, what you're going to see is a list of steps that each startup goes through in order to launch a startup. They'll be floating onto the screen one by one. I want you to just read them as they come on. After the screen is fully populated, then I'll talk with you a little bit more about them. So here are the steps that are required to launch a business. It's quite different from what we've been talking about in regards to innovation. These are literally the nuts and bolts, step-by-step process that's required that each company go through in order to start a business. And in here you will see how the business plan plays a key role in the process of getting a business started. So basically, the first one is what we've been talking largely about. Identify the basic business idea, the innovation, the market, the size of the market, the resources required, etc. Second one is to form a team. It's really important to have more than just one person on a founding team. I like to see 3 or more. 2 sometimes works well as well. It just depends on the team. Of course, the team is not the full business. There's usually a lot more, but I'm looking for the right people to be on the job for the founding, and they have the right background and skill so that I know when they come forward, they will lead the business to success. I like to see them answer the 15 questions, which we'll get into, that usually involves doing a lot of market research, building a financial pro forma or the financial forecast and projections for the business in detail, and then also coming up with a strategy for financing the business as well as the what we call the cap table, the capitalization table that describes all the various forms of capital and what the return on investment is likely to be and what ownership value is associated with each of those forms. And then the fourth item is to build a business plan. This is a draft at this point, and it normally includes the financial projections as well as a lot of other items. The fifth is to get a legal entity formed. You need to actually come up with some sort of a name for the business. You need to understand the ownership structure. You'll need to understand how certain decisions are going to be made, how financial resources are going to be acquired and distributed. You need to get some advice on all of these things. So the next step is to get good advice from professionals on those. Next step then it would be to create the entity. Depending on where you are and what kind of resources you have, this can either be very difficult or very hard. But actually creating the entity in Vietnam requires that you get an enterprise registration certificate. It also requires that you get an investor registration certificate. Both of those involve providing large numbers of documents to the Ministry of Investment and Planning. Then you need to open bank accounts in the name of the company. That's also a very cumbersome process requiring a lot of documentation, but usually banks are happy to help you with that as long as you satisfy all their documentation requirements. Then you want to seed the business. Normally your founding team members come up with the first amount of capital to get the company going, but that could actually be from their parents or from friends or relatives. After that, you want to start looking at the production version of your business plan. Remember earlier we talked about a draft business plan. Now we want to produce the production version, the final version. And this actually becomes your primary marketing material for recruiting people to join the business or support the business, and most importantly, invest in the business. So when I say production version, it's a very nice looking document. It's very well produced. It's your primary marketing tool. It also includes probably a PowerPoint presentation. Then you need to get all of the documents required to raise capital. Those are normally some sort of investor registration certificate update, as well as some contractual arrangements between the company and the investors, and modifications to maybe the enterprise registration certificate. But basically, there's a lot of documentation required to bring in the primary capital to grow the business. So getting those documents in place is necessary to be prepared, because the next thing you're going to do is you're going to go talk to investors. The investors are going to want to hear you talk personally with them to provide the business plan, to give them a PowerPoint pitch. They're also going to want to look at your legal documents that describe how their investment is going to work in the company, what rights it provides them. And then finally, you need to close the capital. That means get the people to literally invest in your company, to give you the money, put it in the bank account, and you provide them a share certificate, ownership certificates. Then after you've done all that, you can actually start running your business. You can actually do what you originally planned to do in the work you did before this, in terms of identifying the market and the customer base and the innovation that you're going to bring to market for commercialization. So now that you see the steps for forming and launching a new business, you can see that the business plan actually forms a really important role in this process. It really is the primary document that describes your whole business. It describes a lot about how you're going to build the business, what it's going to do, what resources, people, financial requirements, projections, etc. It is the primary governing document for using the information you've been developing to communicate with other people. So let's get into now discussing the details of the business plan. So another way to look at the business plan is to think about the challenges of growing a business. We need to identify those and describe how we're going to address them in every possible way in a very succinct form in the business plan. So these are challenges I've listed here that all businesses are confronted with. So let's go through them step by step. First is customers. Every business needs customers, and you need a way to get to your customers, to develop relationships with them, to identify them. Those are called channels. Every business needs that. Second one is a value proposition. No matter how big or small a company is, you need to be able to describe what your value proposition is. In other words, what is your innovation, and what value does it create for your customers? It better be unique, it better be different, it better be sustainable, it better be something that has enough value in it that you can share with your customer, which means it also needs to add value. It's not just a substitutional value. Third, you need some differentiating competitive strategy. How are you going to sell your product when the customer has a choice between your product and another product from a competition, or maybe your service? You've got to have some way to clearly describe why your product or service is different from your competition's, and furthermore, why that is advantageous or attractive to your customer. The next item is driven team of founders. This is critical. I would never be involved in a startup company that doesn't have a driven team of founders. And sometimes that's just me. But more often than not, I've got a team of people with me who are just as passionate and driving hard as I am. So that is necessary that we explain that to prospective investors and others. Who are our founders and what is the passion in their hearts? Advisors. Advisors are really important. First off, if you don't have experience or knowledge or a background and you're a young startup, then this is great. You can make yourself look larger and more experienced and deeper by just bringing on a team of experienced advisors, people who've already been there, done that, and they can give you direction and help you stay on track. So this is a great way to bridge the gap between having very little experience and needing to look like you have that in order to raise capital. The next thing about advisors is if you select the best ones, you will get really, really good advice. And that's essential if you're going to build a good quality business. Advice is not cheap. Advice usually comes through many years of experience, many years of making mistakes, or maybe the right decisions and learning that those are the right things to do. So we have to keep in mind that advisors, although they're not directly involved in the business, certainly not founders, they're an extremely valuable part of our overall strategy. So let's find out who they are. The sixth thing is resources. We need to talk about our resources. What are we using to build this business? So we need to talk about time. How much time? Where's the time? Who's going to provide the time? The facilities that we work in, where we meet. Where's the equipment? What equipment do we need? How much does it cost? What's the lifetime on it? What kind of maintenance is required? Our network of services. What kind of services are we going to need, like accountants and lawyers and maintenance people and sales staff? Or what kind of outside support services do we need? And what are they? Who are they? Access to supplies. We're not talking just pencils and papers and pens here. We're talking about maybe chemicals. We're talking about specialty products that are necessary, like wood products or steel products or glass products. Maybe we're talking about certain types of consumables that are used by people like food. Who knows what they are? We need fabrics. We need to get our supplies. Money, obviously an issue. How much money do we need? When do we need it? How are we going to get it? Let's talk about that. Employees. What kind of employees do we need? What skills? What background? How many do we need? How much are we going to pay them? What are we going to do to help them grow through training? What kind of benefits are we going to provide? On and on. Number 7, the processes and systems that we deliver value to our customer. Okay, what are the processes and systems? This goes to, are we going to do it through the internet? Are we going to do it by drop shipping through direct sales from a wholesaler or manufacturer? Are we going to have our own trucks that we're going to deliver ourselves? How are we going to deliver, and what systems and processes are we going to use? How are we going to keep track of that? What kind of systems are we going to use to know that process or services or products have been delivered and been paid for? Speaking of pay, the next item is means to collect. We need to have a team and a methodology for collecting our income and also for paying our suppliers. How are we going to do that? Next item is tools and procedures that we use to measure progress and results. Is this very simple, like an Excel spreadsheet? Or is this a very sophisticated system, like an ERP system or a CRM system? What are we going to be using to measure progress and results? Certainly in accounting, we need to be measuring financial results. And then last, I've got continuous ability to learn. This is important for all companies as they grow and become more powerful and more valuable. So how are we going to do that? Are we going to have internal reviews? Are we going to have documentation that describes what we've learned and what our processes are? Are we going to train employees on that? Are we going to have employees create those, improve those? What sort of management procedures do we use to make sure that the company is continuously learning and growing and improving? Here we're showing an outline of a typical business plan that could be used to launch a startup. You may recall in our pre-class study materials, there were two types of business plans that were discussed. There was the standard traditional business plan, and there was the lean startup business plan. This one's probably closer to the traditional one, but it's even slightly different. It basically has the primary elements, and I'll walk you through each of these one by one. So the first one is the executive summary. Um, I've written many executive summaries, I've written many business plans, and I can tell you almost always that even though it's the first page in the first document element that is read in the business plan, it is usually almost always the last item that's written. So the summary, normally, as you know, a summary comes at the end of a document. In this case, it comes in the beginning of the document, and in almost all cases, really can't even be written until you've finished the entire plan. But the executive summary includes key highlights from all the other areas in the business plan that enables an investor to determine very quickly whether it's the kind of opportunity they're interested in and what type of investment is required and what return on investment is expected and who's involved, what market are we going after, what's the strategy. It normally is a one-page document. I've seen it as 2 pages, but it's usually a document that is very well produced and can act as a standalone entity. Normally it's printed out and handed to prospective investors as maybe the first thing that they look at among all the documents. It's the primary marketing tool of the primary marketing tool. It's the number one piece. Okay, the second item here is the company overview. And here we're talking about, what form of company is it? Is it a limited liability company? Is it a joint stock company? Is it single owner, multiple owner? Things like that. We're also talking about how the business is going to be developed. What market is it going to serve? Basically, where is it going to be located? What's its primary mission? What are they trying to accomplish? What are you trying to accomplish with your business? What kind of structure does it have? A board of directors or advisors? How many directors, multiple directors? Is it foreign owned or not? And who are the founders? Who are the people? What are their names? What are their skills and backgrounds? What's their history? We want to know a little bit more about the whole structure and the elements of the business here. The third item here is the marketing research. And this usually includes data that is relevant to help the reader understand the market opportunity, why the innovation that we're bringing to the market is valuable. There's some analysis of that to bring out some key points that are worth considering when making an investment. There's also a description of what the customers look like in that market, who they might be actually, some prospective customers, what their interests are. Competitors, clearly no matter what we do in a market, we're going to have competitors. As we discussed earlier, we could have direct competitors, we could have substitutional competitors, and we could actually have new entrants. So we want to outline those carefully. And then finally, legal. What are the legal aspects of working in a particular market? Some markets have very few legal requirements. Others have a high degree of legal requirements. For example, the financial industries have a lot of legal requirements to satisfy. Medical product industries, things like that, they usually have a lot of legal requirements to satisfy. So we need to outline what are those constraints and requirements that need to be satisfied within the legal research section. Next section is products and services. What items are we actually going to supply to our customers? What products, what services, what needs are we satisfying with those that the customer has? How strong is that need? How critically are we going to be able to supply products and services that satisfy those needs? What are the values that our service or products provide to our customers? What value do we create for them? What value does it potentially create for us? Here, it could be very helpful if we could be quantitative, as a matter of fact, just really reduce it down to monetary values. It helps to be very specific about how much value we're going to create with our innovation when we satisfy their needs. Differentiation refers to how our product or service is different from the competition. Earlier in the market research section, we talked about our competitors. Now it's important that we describe how our products or services compare to our competitors and how they're uniquely different and why they're different and why that creates value for the customer. And then ultimately, we need to talk about multipliers. Multipliers are items that allow us to get multiple sales and multiple product or service sales off of the same product or service development cost. So we're looking for things that provide a substantial increase in our return on investment. In other words, we don't want to sell the product or service just once. We want to sell it many, many times over. So what are the multipliers that come along with the type of product or service we're offering? In the fifth section, we're talking about marketing and sales. These are sort of the steps and processes we will go through to actually find customers and then describe what challenges there are around doing that. Sometimes it's very easy to find customers. Sometimes it's very challenging, and we have to draw upon a lot of different channels and resources to find them and to approach them. We need to understand what our sales and marketing strategy is. We need to have an understanding of what types of ways are we going to capture the attention of these customers and then ultimately convert them into revenue generating relationships. And then finally, we need to understand how will our competition react. They're going to see our marketing material. They're going to hear about our approach to their customers and potential customers. They're going to see our sales indirectly or directly have an impact on their sales. So over time, they are going to react. They're not going to be complacent. They're going to be very concerned about how we adversely affect their business. So here, we need to understand how the reactions from competition will affect our ability to market our product and to sell our product. In the next section, we're looking at financial projections. This needs to be very detailed, probably an Excel spreadsheet with some graphs and charts, pie charts, etc. We need to show what the expenses are, the income, the profit of operating the business into the future, preferably 3 years or more. Also, it's very helpful if we can show graphically and numerically where the break-even point is and also describe what the startup funding needs are. There are really easy ways to do that, and it's not difficult to show those things graphically and to put numerical values on them. But investors are primarily going to be interested in looking at those items, break even and funding needs. We're also want to look at what the request for funding is and the expected return on investment. We can build what's called the cap table that describes the sources of funds and how they're going to be structured among all the various forms of capital we're going to use to fund the business. And then we can also calculate over time what the expected return on those investments are going to be. That's another thing that investors are going to be very keen to look at. And then, of course, if for some reason we're not dealing with a startup, we're dealing with a restart or an expansion capital, Then we want to look at current financial statements. We want to know how the income has gone, the cash flow, and the balance sheet in particular. We might even want to look at the journal entries, the general ledger, to look at some of the details. But these things, of course, can be included in the appendix. That's the next section. So in the appendix, we want to put all types of supporting documents, any credit histories and resumes of the founders, pictures of prototypes or products, letters of reference, licenses that we have or need to acquire, permits, patents that we have, legal documents that we've already put together that might describe the relationship with the prospective investor, things like this. So all the heavy lifting documents that an analyst might want to look at in great detail to assist in a prospective investor to determine whether they want to be involved with the company. So these are items that would normally be included in a business plan. Now, you can also find example business plans in some of the materials I sent to you earlier, the pre-class preparation materials, especially in the reference, the third one from the United States Small Business Administration. There are materials in there that help you look at example business plans. Those are very helpful for building your own. Okay, one of the more important parts of the business plan is the financial multiplier. You've heard me talk about it often in this presentation, and we haven't really defined it more precisely. We've talked about basically the types of businesses that provide financial multipliers, but we haven't talked about the multiplier itself. So I want to talk a little bit about that right now because it is such a critical part of the business plan. The business plan needs to have in it a financial multiplier. And in this case, I'm referring to entrepreneurial financial multiplier because primarily for a startup, what's being multiplied is the entrepreneurial's time, the value of the entrepreneurial's time investment in the business. In order for the entrepreneur to take the risk of starting a business, that needs to be a substantial number. It also needs to be a substantial number in order to raise capital. So in terms of a financial multiplier for the entrepreneur, I'm just using a metric here that I feel pretty comfortable with, which is 20 times in 5 years. So what does that mean? 20 times what? And why 5 years? And what about 15 times or 30 times? Well, 20 times is pretty aggressive actually. For any type of investment to grow 20 times in a 5-year period is incredibly high rate of return. That's what we need in order to justify the startup. So we need to find a business risk and a value proposition and a customer base in a market that allows us the opportunity to multiply the entrepreneur's time investment by 20 times over a 5-year period. We talk about 20 times over 5 years of investment. I want to try and help put that into perspective for us. I said that's a pretty substantial rate of return. Well, let me show you why. If you look at inflation in Vietnam has run around 4.5% for the last few years. Last year it was actually below 4%. It was a pretty nice number. It's pretty good for inflation. But in order to invest and make a good return on investment, we have to at least get 4.5% back. To offset the loss due to inflation, the investment has to return greater than 4.5% per year. Well, in Vietnam, you can invest in government bonds, 10-year bonds, and they provide a relatively low risk liquid rate of return of about 5.2%. I think more closely to 6% now. But that's pretty nice. A 6% return compared to a 4% inflation rate is a very reasonable investment considering that it's fairly low risk. And it's not only low risk, we can also sell the bonds at any time we want, so they're very liquid. It's almost like having cash in your hand, but it actually is better than cash because it provides more return on investment than inflation. Inflation just erodes the value of cash. If you invest in the Vietnam stock market, over the long run, you're going to make about 10% per year. Now, of course, the return on that investment is quite erratic. If you look at any one point in time, you see the number goes up and down quite radically, and sometimes it's unbelievable amounts. Over half the value is lost in very short periods of time. The stock market, however, is a fairly good place to invest over the long run because it's higher risk than bonds and therefore produces a substantially higher rate of return, around 9 to 10%. And it's also liquid, which means you can sell your stock at almost any time you want, usually within a day or two. It's just about as liquid as owning a government bond. So for taking on a little bit more risk, we can make 10% per year, which greatly is exceeding over the inflation rate, which is around 4% or less. So after inflation, we're actually going to make about a 6% rate of return on our investment in the stock market. Well, 6% net or 10% including inflation is a pretty good return on investment, but there's no real problem here. There's no issue with liquidity. We can sell the stock at any time. And if we hold the stock for the same amount of period of time we were going to invest in a startup, it's going to give us about a 10% rate of return. So why shouldn't we invest in the stock market if we're only going to get 10%? We need to get a lot more than 10% in our investment in a startup in order to justify the fact that it's not liquid, we can't sell the company, and it's very high risk. So we need to get a lot more rate of return on that. The other piece is usually that's the only thing going on in our life. We're putting our full life into that, whereas in the stock market or a government bond, we're not. We invest in those and then we go off and we do our life. We have a job that creates income usually. Now, if we said we wanted to get 15% per year, that's a 2x in 5 years. That's still quite a long ways off from 20x. 20x in 5 years is equivalent to an 82.2% return per year. That's enormous compared to the 10% per year we would expect to get from the stock market. So that's why we need a very good, strong entrepreneurial financial multiplier that's built into the business model. Let's talk a little bit more about the risk associated with being an entrepreneur in a startup. I've got a little graph here that shows you basically what I was talking about on the prior slide, of a linear projection of how an investment grows over time out to 10 years with those various rates: inflation, government 10-year bonds, the stock market, 2x in 5 years, 20x in 5 years, 100% in per year. So you can see that the rate of return we're expecting for being an entrepreneur is huge compared to, for example, what we would get in the stock market. Now, why is that? Why do we need that? Well, look at this risk list. First off, it's illiquid. We cannot sell our position in a startup. We are the entrepreneur. We are the company. You cannot sell yourself. You cannot sell your part of the company easily until the company is mature. So there's no way you can say at 2 or 3 years into it, oh, I want to sell out now. You're really going to be there 5, 7, 10 years if you're going to do a startup. And you're not going to get a substantial return on your investment until you either sell the company or a substantial part of it, or you develop a capability to produce a lot of profit. So it's an illiquid investment. You're taking a lot of risk. And secondly, like I said earlier, it's an all-in investment. You not only are putting your money into it, but you're putting your whole life into it. You're not able to make money by working another job. So this is where you're putting your time and your money. It's all in. You don't have any other way to support your family usually, or to plan for the future. This is your future. That's a very high risk to put all of your focus and your energy into one company. In fact, in the stock market, you would never do that. Even if the stock market is a fairly good rate of return and a much lower risk, you still would not take the risk of putting all your money in one company. You would have a portfolio of companies. So it's very risky from that perspective. Third, it requires a lot of work. If you invest in the stock market, it requires no work. You just basically let it go. And a few years later, you check back and you say, oh, it looks like I might want to sell now. You can hold it just as long as you would for a startup, 5 years. And it requires no work. It just does it on its own. So that work needs to be compensated somehow. And you're probably not going to make much money in the first few years of the company. In fact, you probably won't make any money in the first 2 years. It's a stress on your family. Your family is going to have to do with less money. They're not going to see you around as much. And as a result, your family is going to have to work a lot harder to take care of itself without your needs, your support. So it's a huge stress. Beyond that, there's also the stress of the risk. Your family bears that stress as well. Even though you're the one who's taking most of the risks, they know that if you don't succeed, they don't succeed. So it's a lot of stress on your family. That needs to be compensated. There's competition. I mean, in the stock market, for example, you can put your money wherever you want. You can move it around easily. You can choose which companies you want to invest in. You might want to invest in a whole bunch of companies that do the same thing. There's no competition. But for you, there is competition. Your company has competitors and they may win the race. That's a lot of risk. You don't have the choice of taking your money out of your company and putting it in a different company when things start to go sour. The only way you can win is to be a winner, to make sure your company succeeds. So competition is a very high risk. The economy can devastate companies. And when it comes time for a recession to hit, boy, I tell you what, there's nothing that hurts companies more. And in the time of a recession, you can actually choose to sell all of the company stock that you own and put it into cash. Or you could put your investments into government bonds or treasury bills. You don't have to necessarily keep it in the stocks where they're going to be hurt the most by an economic recession. You don't have that capability in your own company. When the economy goes bad and you have very little control, none really, over when that happens, you're going to be stuck. You're going to have to ride it out in your company. Otherwise, you're going to have to go bankrupt, and that's not a good thing. So that's a very high risk. You need to be rewarded for that risk. And poor execution. I mean, let's face it, nobody executes perfectly, and sometimes you make the wrong choices. You make mistakes. If you make a wrong choice or you make a big mistake, you can actually damage the value of your company quite a bit. You don't have that problem when you invest in other companies. Usually they're more mature, they're led by stronger executive teams that know what they're doing. They've been around for many years, they have a lot of skill. And by the way, if they're not doing too well, guess what? Normally somebody replaces them with somebody who can. Or if they don't, you can take your money out of that company and put it in another company. So execution risk, yes, affects all companies, but it definitely affects startups more, especially when you're the guy leading the company and your skills and knowledge and ability may not be nearly as strong as somebody who's been doing it for 30, 40 years. The one thing you do have is control to some degree. In other words, you can control what markets you're in, what risks you take, what types of investments you make in your people, what kind of innovation you create. You have control over a lot of things. You also have control of maybe when you sell the company, or if you choose not to make an investment or to make an investment in expanding the company. You have a lot of control that you don't have in investing in a company in the stock market. So These are the reasons why we need to have a high rate of return. It's got to be substantially higher than what we would get in the stock market. And that's how we come up with this idea of 20x in 5 years, or 85 to 100% growth per year over 5 years. It has to be substantially enough to make sure that when you invest your time and your money in this company, that you're going to be very well rewarded for taking that much risk. It's only fair. Furthermore, you're going to want to bring in investors at some point, outside investors, and you need to have enough opportunity available in the company to make sure those investors are rewarded for taking the risk with you. They're not taking nearly as much risk as you are, but still they're taking more risk than if they were investing in the stock market. So you need to be able to reward them for taking that risk, usually 2 to 3 times more than in the stock market. So that's why we need to have that in there. We need to have a good, solid multiplier built into our business plan. Otherwise, it's probably not a good use of our time.
Now that we've discussed the need for the financial multiplier to compensate for the risk that you're taking as an entrepreneur, and we've also described how that financial multiplier compares to other standard investments, let's now talk about where the financial multiplier comes from, how you acquire it as an entrepreneur, and what size does it need to be. So here we're looking at a slide that shows that we have a multiplier effect. So where is that multiplier? Where does it come from? Well, fundamentally, it's the operation of the business itself that creates the multiplier. The operation of the business converts your first 2 years of labor and the risk you're taking into the ability to buy the results of about 40 labor years from other people. So the multiplier in this case is 20. We're taking your first 2 years of working as an entrepreneur without pay and converting it into 40 years of labor from other people. That multiplier is a direct result of the fact that you are taking a substantial amount of risk. The multiplier has to be large in order to convert the amount of risk you're taking into something that is worth it economically. In this case, we're saying it's 20x. Your 2 years at no pay is returned to you as 40 years of other people's labor after 5 years. Now notice that the actual multiplier itself is embedded in the operation of the business. The operation of the business. So in other words, part of the way the business strategy is designed and developed and the way the business operates converts your 2 years into 40 years. Now that we know that the entrepreneurial financial model results from how the business operates, we can now dig a little bit deeper into what the entrepreneurial financial model has to do with the business plan. Well, the business model for the business itself has to be based upon the financial multiplier. The financial multiplier is a direct result of the business model and how it's constructed. The business strategy that is used to develop the business and operate the business and grow it will show how the multiplier is developed. Once we understand the multiplier in itself, it'll be easy to look at the plans and the strategy and the financials to see how the financial multiplier actually works. The multiplier effect is measurable. It's not just a concept. Certainly it can be something that can be easily described intuitively, but in the business plan, we have financial models that show what the projections of the financial performance of the business will be. And in those financial models, we'll be able to clearly demonstrate in a quantitative fashion how the multiplier works and how well it works. The business plan numbers then will actually show, at this point, an enormous return on investment to the entrepreneur himself and also to the investors. These numbers will be quite easily readable and determined by looking at the financial projections. So where does that come from? The multiplier comes from the innovation. Now, we talked a little while ago about the various types of innovations that you can find in a business, and every one of them, as you may go back and look now, you will see has a multiplier. They have an enormous multiplier that produces a large amount of wealth. So every business plan that you would like to work with as an entrepreneur needs to have innovation. And that innovation is the root cause of the entrepreneurial financial multiplier. And ideally, the investment that is placed in the business through the entrepreneur's time, through any capital they put in, and investments from other third-party sources, we normally refer to those as the investors, that capital is going to be invested in the company in a way that develops the innovation. It establishes the innovation and, as a result, the multiplier that results from it. That multiplier will be producing income over and over and over again in a repetitive fashion. The faster it produces it, the more the multiplier. And over time, that multiplier should grow and grow with the business. So the innovation itself then needs to be clearly described in the business plan. So the first point in the business plan is the description of the innovation. The next would be the strategy for developing the business around the innovation. Third would be how the operations are going to work around marketing, sales, revenue generation, profit generation. And then finally, of course, how the financial projections are going to look for the company in a way that produces the entrepreneurial financial multiplier. That multiplier and the income it produces will ultimately be the source of the return on investment to the entrepreneur and to the third-party investors. Earlier, we discussed that the financial multiplier needs to produce somewhere around 100% per year return, maybe lower, probably no lower than 80% per year. Or another way to look at it would be 20 times the investment over 5 years. And as we mentioned before, that comes out to a little over 82% per year. But where's the item that's being multiplied? What is actually being multiplied? How do we calculate what the return on investment is for the financial multiplier as seen by the entrepreneur and as seen by the investor? We're going to look into that here on this slide a little bit. From the investor's point of view, the return on investment is simply the amount of capital that they receive from the company years later compared to the amount of capital they initially invested in the company. So that investment is described as invested capital, and the return comes from a liquidity event, some sort of exit plan, and you could compare then the return that they received compared to the invested capital, and then calculate what the return on investment would be on an annualized basis. Now, normally the investor will put their capital in not expecting to see a return for many years. A startup company will not generate dividends for many years until the company is very mature, and maybe not even ever. But there's going to be some way that the investor can measure what their return on investment is. And by using an internal rate of return calculation and describing the dividend payments and ultimately the sale of the stock that they have purchased, they can calculate what their internal rate of return is. And that return on investment should look like something like 20 to 30 or 25 to 35% per year. Investors who invest in startups have lots of options that can produce very high rates of return. And of course, they can always invest in the stock market. But compared to the stock market, the investor has a huge amount of risk while investing in a startup company. They can't sell their stock easily either. There's not a lot of places where they can sell it, and there's not a lot of people who would want to buy it. So they are taking a big risk that when they put their money into the company, they may never see it again. In fact, the company may go out of business and not even pay dividends. So the entrepreneur takes a huge amount of risk, enormous risk, but so does the investor compared to options they may have otherwise. So without a very healthy expected return on investment, it's difficult to convince an investor to put money into the startup. Because of this, the entrepreneur has to convince the investor through their business plan, through the financial projections shown in the business plan, that the investor is going to get a very healthy rate of return that exceeds most of the other options that they have available to them in a relatively safe way, at least safe relative to other startups. And that rate of return, again, should be somewhere in the 20 to 30 range per year. And finally, again, here we return to the entrepreneur's point of view. So what is the source of capital that's being multiplied when we look at the entrepreneur? How can we quantitatively describe the investment that the entrepreneur has made in the company? In principle, it can be extremely difficult and complex. But if we want to make the numbers make sense and come up with some way to quantitatively describe what the multiplier is, we have to ultimately describe the initial investment in terms of hard dollars. And this is not as difficult to do as it might seem. First off, almost every entrepreneur invests actual real hard cash in their business. It's very rare for any entrepreneur to start a company without actually putting cash into it. Entrepreneurs have to be careful to understand how much cash they are putting in. Sometimes they'll just spend it out of their pocket, or they'll make withdrawals from a bank account and spend it without really keeping track of it. Or they might make a credit card payment, and that gets paid through personal funds. But regardless, those are capital investments going into the business. The entrepreneur needs to know how much that is. And preferably, the entrepreneur purchased equity in the business with that capital, and so the capital is actually reflected in hard ownership rather than in terms of some loan value. Secondly, and more importantly, there's the opportunity cost. As we described earlier, the entrepreneur is probably going to have to give up a nice paying job in order to start the business. And as they're starting the business, they're not going to get a paycheck. The business is not going to have enough capital to make salaries for its first key employees. And a good rule of thumb to work with there, again, is 2 years. There's a loss of income that's available otherwise to the entrepreneur of about 2 years. Now, how would you say that those 2 years would be worth some salary or some salary amount if they're not actually getting it, if the company's not actually paying it? Well, in effect, what's happened is the entrepreneur has purchased equity in the company with that money and then paid themselves back in terms of salary. In reality, of course, they don't do that, but in principle, that's what it boils down to. All the money they would have made had they continued to work on a job is exactly the same amount of capital that's going into building the business. You might say it's a little bit more or a little bit less, depending on the circumstances. But to be fair about it, we can look at what the entrepreneur was making before they decided to start the business and say that 2 years of that income is what was invested in the company. Maybe a little bit more if you think the employee or the entrepreneur would have received a raise in the second year. But in principle, 2 years times their salary before they left to start the company is a fair way to measure what that value is. We have to, of course, include things like benefits because they're probably not getting paid for benefits or paying for benefits. That's income that the employee had when they were employed, and they're going to have to try and find a way to pay for those benefits in a way that provides the same value as what they received before they left their company. Those benefits will include things like health care and time off and contributions to some sort of government pension, things like that. So if we calculate what would be a fully loaded salary for the employee over 1 year's time and multiply that by 2, that would be a fair way to describe what the contribution to the company was by the opportunity costs that the entrepreneur incurred. Our next item would be the savings they spent. Now, we already talked about savings that was spent for maybe the business issues, but we also have to consider the fact that the entrepreneur needs to continue to support themselves personally and also their family. All these expenses are real, and they're almost certainly going to be paid for out of the savings account that the family has built over many years. So that's additional money that is invested in the company that otherwise wouldn't have been spent had the employee not left their job. So we have those 3 elements that can be easily quantified and written down on paper. Actual capital invested, the opportunity cost of a fully loaded salary that they forego for 2 years, and the savings that's spent to sustain their family that they wouldn't have spent otherwise. Now, those 3 hard costs are the value that gets multiplied. And again, we're looking for a multiplier that produces an annual rate of return of somewhere between 82% and 100% per year. If a business doesn't produce a substantial rate of return like this on that investment, then it's really not considered to be a very valuable opportunity. So this is actually what's being multiplied. And we should be able to show without any doubt how that's going to work when we start our business and what that multiplier is going to be. Now, if we come up with a multiplier that is significantly lower than these amounts, then we probably don't have a good enough business model. We probably don't have an innovation that can be commercialized well enough to create the financial multiplier that's needed to make it worth our while. So I ask my students to think very hard about this. Tell me, what is your innovation? Tell me how it's going to create a multiplier. Tell me, what is that multiplier? If I take the money that you lost by not working, the money you invested in the company, and the money you pulled out of savings to support your family, and I add that together, and then I find out how much money you're going to make in the company over 5 years, is the amount you make 20 times bigger than what you put into it. If it doesn't meet that criteria or come close, then we need to rethink the business. All right, thank you for your time.